It's the most terrifying nuclear weapon ever built. A reactor the size of a locomotive, with no shielding around its core, screaming just over the treetops at 3 times the speed of sound. A shockwave powerful enough to instantly claim the life of anyone caught beneath its flight path. And a trail of radioactive exhaust seared into the air for hundreds of miles behind it. It has as many as 16 hydrogen bombs aboard, each one destined for a different city. And when the last one has been dropped, and the mission is technically complete, the missile simply keeps flying, poisoning everything below with radiation until the reactor's fuel is spent. The United States built this nightmarish weapon at the height of the Cold War. They called it the Flying Crowbar, an enormous, nearly indestructible steel tube designed to crudely bludgeon its targets with unstoppable force. Now, in the 21st century, it's set to be revived, in the hands of someone who seems fully prepared to use it. Some weapons exist because of a specific, durable fear, one that doesn't belong to any particular decade, but resurfaces whenever the strategic balance shifts. Not the fear of what your enemy might do to you, but of what they might do to your ability to fight back. In Washington, D.C. in the mid-1950s, that fear had a very specific shape. Soviet missile technology was advancing at a pace that American intelligence found increasingly difficult to track and increasingly alarming to contemplate. The U.S. military's ability to deter a Soviet nuclear strike rested on what strategists called the nuclear triad: bombers, land-based ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched missiles. The logic being that no enemy could destroy all 3 simultaneously, and the guaranteed threat of retaliation was enough to keep either side from striking first. It worked, but only as long as each leg of the triad remained viable. Bombers could be intercepted. Ballistic missiles might eventually be shot down by Soviet anti-missile defenses that were already under active development. Submarines could, in theory, be tracked and destroyed before they launched. The US had built its entire structure of deterrence on the assumption the Soviets could never neutralize all 3 at once. But if even one leg became vulnerable, the logic began to unravel. And if 2 became compromised, the unthinkable would suddenly seem dreadfully imaginable. The United States Air Force faced a conundrum. What do you build that no defense can ever stop? It would have to be fast enough that interceptors couldn't reach it, low enough that radar couldn't reliably find it, durable enough that nothing short of direct hit could bring it down. Something that could be launched, forgotten about, and trusted to arrive. As it happened, a concept had already been taking shape that seemed almost tailor-made for exactly this requirement. The idea was a weapon unlike anything that had come before, one that would be powered by a nuclear ramjet, where a conventional missile burns chemical fuel for thrust, limiting its range to whatever it can carry. A nuclear ramjet works differently. Air, forced into the engine by the missile's own forward motion, passes through a nuclear reactor and is superheated to enormous temperatures. It expands rapidly and is expelled through a nozzle, generating thrust. No fuel is required. It has no range limit. As long as the reactor ran, the missile would fly. On January 1st, 1957, the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission selected the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Livermore, California, to develop such a weapon. The project was given the name Pluto, the Roman god of the underworld. 9 months later, on October 4th, 1957, the world woke up to unexpected news. Much sooner than anyone in the West had anticipated, the Soviets had successfully launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik. It was a beach ball-sized metal sphere, transmitting a simple radio pulse as it arced overhead. In isolation, it seemed almost absurdly harmless. but what it represented stopped U.S. military planners cold. A rocket powerful enough to loft a payload into orbit was also one powerful enough to deliver a nuclear warhead to any point on Earth. At Livermore, the men working on Project Pluto didn't need to be told what it meant. The problem they'd been handed was no longer theoretical. The question was whether the man they had chosen to lead them was equal to what was coming. Ted Merkel was not the kind of man the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory usually put in charge of things. Unorthodox, irreverent, and constitutionally allergic to the idea that a problem might not have a solution, he was given responsibility for the most technically demanding component of Project Pluto, the nuclear reactor that would power the new weapon. He had a motto that would define the entire effort: the hotter the better. Because the efficiency of a nuclear ramjet increases with temperature. In practice, this meant Merkel was setting out to build something that would operate under conditions almost no material on Earth could survive. The reactor had to run at a peak of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, conventional metals don't just weaken. They become white hot and lose all structural integrity. The entire reactor core had to be built from something that didn't yet exist. A ceramic capable of withstanding not just the heat, but the violent airflow of a Mach 3 ramjet, the corrosive effects of rain, salt air, and atmospheric pressure, and the continuous bombardment of intense nuclear radiation, all simultaneously, for the duration of a mission thousands of miles long. Merkel commissioned the Coors Porcelain Company in Colorado to manufacture the fuel elements. Nearly 500,000 of them, each one a pencil-shaped ceramic tube, packed together in a honeycomb pattern to form the reactor core. The same company that had spent decades making ceramic-lined vats for breweries was now producing the heart of the United States' most dangerous weapon. The tolerances Merkel's team were working to were not merely demanding. They were, in places, genuinely frightening. The reactor's critical base plates, where temperatures would be highest, had an auto-ignition point just 150 degrees above the reactor's own peak operating temperature. An extremely slim separation between a functioning weapon and an uncontrolled catastrophe. Measuring those temperatures presented its own problem, since standard heat-sensitive probes would be instantly destroyed by the reactor's heat and radiation. Engineer Richard Werner solved it by developing a method of reading the temperature from movie film of the operating reactor, comparing the color of the glowing metal against a calibrated scale. Other solutions were less sophisticated, and none the worse for it. When exotic materials failed as a coating for the electric motor armatures, the team tried exhaust manifold paint, sourced through an advertisement in Hot Rod magazine, and found it worked perfectly. Support springs inside the reactor were held in place during assembly with mothball spacers, which evaporated after serving their purpose. When the reactor's tight confines proved too narrow for the lab's technicians to reach the final set of diagnostic instruments, a petite secretary from the Propulsion Engineering Division was recruited to insert them instead. There was something almost cheerful about the ingenuity. It was the atmosphere of people who were very good at their work, very well funded, and thoroughly engaged with an extraordinary problem. What occasionally got lost in the excitement was the nature of that problem. They were building a reactor that, from the moment it was first switched on, would be lethally radioactive to anyone who approached it. And that was before it left the ground. In order to safely test the weapon, Merkel and his men would need an enormous quantity of concrete. So much that the US government had to purchase an aggregate mine simply to guarantee the supply. The walls of the disassembly building at Site 401, the facility constructed at Jackass Flats in the Nevada desert to house Project Pluto's testing program, were 6 to 8 feet thick. The operations inside would be conducted entirely by remote control, observed through 4-foot lead glass viewing windows. There were showers, a radiation safety room, and hot cells equipped with remote manipulators. The building had been designed, from the ground up, around a single governing assumption: that nobody inside it could safely be in the same room as the reactor once it had been run. Moving the reactor between the test stand and the disassembly building, a distance of nearly 2 miles, required a fully automated railway, since no human operator could ride with it. The locomotive was controlled remotely. A backup diesel engine existed for emergencies, its cab heavily shielded, to be used only when absolutely necessary. The railway was referred to, with the particular dark humor of people who worked in close proximity to things that put their lives in danger, as the Jackass and Western Railroad. The world's shortest and slowest, and almost certainly its most radioactive. Supplying the compressed air needed to simulate ramjet flight conditions required 25 miles of oil well casing, storing over 1 million pounds of air at extreme pressure. 3 giant compressors had to be borrowed from the Navy's submarine base in Connecticut. A 5-minute full-power test consumed 1 ton of air per second, forcing over 14 million steel balls heated to 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit in 4 enormous steel tanks. The infrastructure required to run the reactor for the duration of a short car journey filled 8 square miles of the Nevada desert. The scientists who would monitor the tests did so from a tin shed at a safe distance, watching on a television screen. Beneath the shed was a fallout shelter, stocked with 2 weeks of food and water. It was described as a precaution. The fact that someone had calculated exactly how long the scientists might need to shelter underground in the event that something went wrong was not dwelt upon. All of it, the concrete walls, the remote railway, the borrowed compressors, the fallout shelter, was what was required to test the reactor while it was standing still, in the middle of an empty desert, with every precaution money could buy. And all of it would be completely useless the moment the reactor left the ground. The first attempt to run the Tory 2A reactor at full power nearly ended in disaster before it had properly begun. During what was intended to be a final qualifications test in January 1961, with air roaring through the reactor at speed, the clamp holding the exit nozzle to the air duct gave way. The nozzle tore free and flew nearly 500 feet through the desert air. Before the team could regroup, a second incident compounded the first. An electrically controlled coupler between the locomotive and the test vehicle suddenly fired without warning, sending the test vehicle careening down the track and slamming violently into the concrete face of the bunker at the end. Every component of the reactor had to be stripped out and checked for cracks. The test stand had to be rebuilt. It was, given what they were working with, a relatively contained mishap, but it was a reminder, if one were needed, of what containment actually meant in the context of a live nuclear ramjet. The reactor wasn't running at full power when either incident occurred. When it was, the consequences of something going wrong would be in a different category entirely. The repairs took months. When Tory 2A finally returned to the test stand, the team worked through a careful sequence of low and intermediate power runs, each one building confidence in the components. Each one watched from behind the concrete walls and the television screens and the fallout shelter, stocked with 2 weeks of food. On May 14th, 1961, with the scientists in the control shed collectively holding their breath, the world's first nuclear ramjet roared to life. It ran for only a few seconds, at a fraction of its rated power. But the reactor did not catch fire, did not go critical, did not do any of the things that the more nervous members of the Atomic Energy Commission had quietly worried it might. The test was declared a complete success. Merkel began work almost immediately on a second reactor. Lighter, more powerful, and closer to what a flyable weapon would actually require. Tory 2B never made it beyond the drawing board. But Tori 2C, the full-scale flight-weight reactor that replaced it, was a different proposition entirely. Capable of sustained low-altitude flight in excess of Mach 3, it had a design power of 500 megawatts, roughly equivalent to a small commercial nuclear power station, compressed into an airframe and pointed at the Soviet Union. The tank farm at Jackass Flats had to be expanded by a factor of 10 to supply it. Filling it took 5 days. The checkout of Tori 2C was meticulous and slow, punctuated by false starts. A faulty wire here, a malfunctioning pressure switch there, each one triggering an automatic shutdown, each one requiring investigation before the next test could proceed. On May 20th, 1964, 3 years almost to the day after the first Tori 2A test, the team was finally ready. The reactor was started, power raised incrementally, and airflow increased in stages. At 461 megawatts, with the core temperature climbing and every system functioning normally, Tori 2C ran at full power for 5 minutes. When the manual shutdown was initiated and the airflow reduced, inspection of the reactor revealed no blockages, no anomalies, no evidence of damage or corrosion. Less radiation had escaped than anyone had predicted. That evening, Merkel loaded a piano into a flatbed truck, borrowed without excessive ceremony from the nearby women's dormitory, and led a convoy through the desert into the town of Mercury, site at the nearest bar, to sing bawdy songs as he tinkled the ivories. The next morning, the group lined up at the medical tent for vitamin B12 injections, the hangover remedy of choice in that era. They had every reason to celebrate. The reactor worked. The concept was proven, and the path to a deployable weapon was open. Project Pluto had done what it set out to do. But success, it turned out, had its own problems. For the first time, the men at Livermore had to seriously confront something they'd been quietly deferring for years. What would happen when it actually flew? The first problem was finding a place to carry out the tests. Anywhere over American soil was immediately ruled out. The missile the military had formally designated the SLAM, an acronym for Supersonic Low Altitude Missile, would spew radioactive exhaust across everything beneath its flight path. Even a perfect test, with no malfunctions and no unexpected radiation release, would be a radiological event over U.S. territory. The question of what happened if something went wrong, if the missile deviated from its course, if the reactor behaved unpredictably, if the flying crowbar lived up to its nickname and simply refused to come down, was one that nobody in Washington was prepared to answer publicly. Jim Hadley, a Livermore physicist who'd worked on the project, asked, quote, "How are you going to convince people that it's not going to get away and run at low level through Las Vegas or even Los Angeles?" One proposal was to tether the missile to the ground during test flights. Hadley would later recall the suggestion with characteristic dryness, observing, quote, "That would have been some tether." A more serious alternative was to fly SLAM in figure eights over Wake Island, the U.S. territory in the Pacific, then ditch the reactor in 20,000 feet of ocean at the end of the flight. Even by the standards of an era in which the AEC was still measuring radioactive contamination in what it optimistically called sunshine units, the prospect of dumping scores of highly radioactive materials into the Pacific was enough to give people pause. By the early 1960s, public awareness of nuclear fallout was growing rapidly, and the political cost of what the test program would require was becoming impossible to ignore. But the flight test problem was only the beginning. The deeper the Pentagon looked at SLAM's operational requirements, the more uncomfortable the picture became. The missile would have to cross Western Europe on its way to Soviet targets, flying at just 500 feet at Mach 3, with an unshielded reactor overhead. The noise level on the ground as it passed was estimated at 150 decibels, enough to rupture eardrums across a wide area and to cause structural damage to anything beneath the flight path. The radioactive exhaust trail would blanket Allied territory before a single bomb had been dropped. The United States' most unstoppable weapon would deafen, flatten, and irradiate its closest allies as a precondition of reaching its targets. Then there was the issue of what to do with the SLAM after it had carried out its bombing mission. As an alternative to crashing it into the ocean, one weapons engineer suggested flying the missile back and forth over Soviet cities, poisoning the population below with radiation until the reactor had used all its fuel. In a world that had started seeing nuclear weapons in a much more negative light, it sounded less like a directed strike and more like a war crime. SLAM was caught in a trap of its own capabilities. Its problems weren't technical, they were political. And in 1964, Washington's will to accept the costs involved simply wasn't there. The missile's critics in the Pentagon had already coined an alternative reading of its acronym: slow, low, and messy. What's more, the conditions that had made an idea like SLAM necessary were changing faster than the project could keep up with. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, had developed quicker than anyone had anticipated, were already operational, and posed none of the radiological problems that had come to define the flying crowbar. The Navy's Polaris missile had removed whatever interest the Navy had once shown. Advances in Soviet radar were beginning to threaten the low-altitude advantage that had been SLAM's central justification. Harold Brown, the Pentagon's Director of Research and Engineering, argued for keeping the project alive at reduced funding. The House Appropriations Committee disagreed. If there was no military requirement, there was no reason to continue. On July 1, 1964, Project Pluto was canceled. Ted Merkel hosted a farewell dinner at a country club near Livermore, complete with bottles of Pluto mineral water and SLAM tie tacks as souvenirs. The reactor that had torn the Nevada desert air open at 461 megawatts would sit at Jackass Flats for another 12 years, too radioactive to approach. Project Pluto hadn't failed. New developments had simply meant nobody in Washington could justify giving it more time to solve the complex puzzles it had presented. Decades later, somebody else decided they would take on that task, in the very place the flying crowbar had been designed to destroy. On March 1, 2018, Vladimir Putin stood before Russia's Federal Assembly and unveiled what he described as an entirely new class of weapon, one that was, in his words, quote, unheard of. Behind him, an animation played, a low-flying missile skimming terrain, ducking beneath radar coverage, ranging freely across the globe. Its range, Putin claimed, was effectively unlimited. No existing defense system could stop it. In certain offices in Washington, the reaction was not alarm so much as recognition. The weapon Putin was describing, formerly designated the 9M730 Burevestnik, known to NATO as Skyfall, was a nuclear-powered cruise missile. A small reactor at its heart would heat incoming air and expel it through a nozzle, providing thrust without fuel, range without limit. It would fly low, hit from unpredictable directions, and could not be intercepted by any ballistic missile defense system, because it wasn't a ballistic missile. It was something older than that. Something that a group of engineers in the Nevada desert had already proved could work, more than half a century earlier. Skyfall was smaller than SLAM, closer in size to a conventional cruise missile and a locomotive. Subsonic instead of supersonic, carrying a single warhead rather than 16. But the principle was identical, and so were the problems. The Burevestnik's test record, even by the standards of experimental weapons development, made for uncomfortable reading. At least 13 known tests since 2016, the majority of them failures. On one occasion, a missile was lost entirely, sinking to the bottom of the sea after a failed test, where it sat for months. On August 8, 2019, a team of weapons scientists gathered at the Neonoska test range on Russia's northern coast to attempt to recover it. The operation ended in an explosion, one which 5 of the scientists did not survive. The Russian government initially denied that anything nuclear had been involved. It was only when Norwegian monitoring stations confirmed a radiation spike that Moscow admitted what had actually happened. Putin, speaking at a ceremony to posthumously award the deceased men, insisted the weapon would be, quote, perfected regardless of anything. It was a revealing choice of words. Project Pluto had been set aside the moment the political cost became too high. When the questions it raised proved too uncomfortable, the test program too radioactive, the implications too difficult to explain to allies. The program now underway had survived a poor test record, a fatal accident, international condemnation, and the quiet acknowledgement that the weapon's own exhaust would contaminate whatever territory it flew over. None of it had given anyone pause. Whether the Americans who built the original were wiser than those now determined to finish what they started, or simply less willing to pay the price, is something the next few years may yet settle.